All right, we now cross to Samgela Masego, our reporter in Midrand at the Gallagher Estate, where the DA Federal Congress is already underway. A very good morning to you, Samgele. I see that seats behind you are now getting filled. What's happening?
Indeed, Simpiwe, delegates are trickling in to the biggest Congress of the Democratic Alliance in its history. Over 2,000 voting delegates are in this Federal Congress of the Democratic Alliance, where John Steenhuisen is going up against Malatse, or rather Malatse is contesting the incumbent federal leader of the Democratic Alliance for the position. We've not yet seen the supporters of Malatse. We've not yet seen her. We've seen the likes of Natasha Mazoni, who's contesting for deputy federal chairperson of the Democratic Alliance, the likes of JP Smith and also Mr. Malatse, whom I'm going to bring in now before I speak to Mr. Angelo Fick. Mr. Malatse, you are contesting for the deputy chairperson of the party. How's your campaign been going?
Look, I think we have done, first of all, greetings to your viewers and to you. It's good to see you. We've done everything we could. At this stage, when it comes here, the delegates have made up their mind as to who they voted for. We've made contact with over 80% of the delegates personally. I've called over 1,250 delegates, and the response has been very warm. And I think we've done everything possible in order to be one of the 3 deputy federal chairpersons. The delegates ultimately decide, and today and tomorrow will be an indication of the preference of the delegates' choices.
How many warm bodies have you spoken to thus far, particularly when you crunch the numbers with your campaign team, that you are assured of 800 votes, 400 votes? How many votes can you say you are assured of, particularly knowing the DA's method of system of clustering those votes?
Look, our system tells us you at least need over 35% of number ones in order to get in. I mean, as I indicated to you, we've spoken personally through calls over 1,200 delegates. That excludes the number of delegates we've spoken to in person. But ultimately, Samgelo, you and I have been in this business long enough to know that talking to people does not necessarily translate into votes. The proof is in the pudding, in the votes that will come out. The best thing about this is, even though there are 7 candidates for the position, 3 will ultimately be voted in.
When you look at the candidates and also the endorsements, you've been endorsed by high prominent leaders within the party, executive mayors. Silas Brink, the spokesperson of the DA, now Mayor of Tshwane, has endorsed you. The Mayor of Cape Town has endorsed you. And also you've got an endorsement through Dean McPherson in KwaZulu-Natal. When you look at those endorsements and the type of support these individuals come with, can you say that it's pretty much in the bag, or you are still jittery with how it will fare out?
The mistake any contestant can make is to be overconfident going into any electoral contest. I feel confident, but again, I've been in this game long enough to know that the proof is in the results. Yeah. The individuals you speak to, I've had a good relationship with a lot of leaders in the party. Jordan Lewis and I were here in this venue when Helen Zille was first elected as the leader of the party. We're in the first class of the Young Leaders Program. Silas Brink, I've known him for over 12 years, and we've worked together as spokesperson. So that is the translation of the personal and the professional relationships that we've had. And the endorsement are a mere continuation of that. Dean McPherson, I've known him since we both became members of parliament in 2014. And we've worked well together. And I think that is the unique element that I bring into this context, the ability to work with different leaders in the party, but most importantly, to serve the party. I've been a spokesperson, you know very well, at difficult moments in the party, you know, and other people came in and the party asked me to come back, and I believe that my longevity and service to the party gives me an advantage over my fellow candidates.
John Steenhuisen or Malatse?
The delegates will decide. As a fellow candidate, I believe that John Steenhuisen has done very well for the party as an incumbent and in stabilizing the party. And why change it if it's working?
So you are voting for John Steenhuisen?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Mr. Malatse, who is contesting for Deputy Federal Chairperson of the Democratic Alliance. I'm going to bring in now Mr. Angelo Fick just to analyze the evolution of the Democratic Alliance. Mr. Fick, when you look at the Democratic Alliance, its evolution, its transitions, Helen Zille, Musi Maimane, now John Steenhuisen, Malatse versus John Steenhuisen now, Helen Zille back in the fold of the Democratic Alliance as the federal chairperson of the party. When you look at this organization, this party, where do you see it? Where it comes from and where it's going towards 2024, and looking at its own race politics and economic policies and the current economic trajectory South Africa finds itself in?
So I think there has been a growth spurt for the party from, shall we say, Tony Leon's leadership to Helen Zilla's leadership. And then there was great hope that Mmusi Maimane would grow the party further. And while many, many people were attracted to the party, particularly younger people, precisely because of Mr. Maimane's leadership, the electoral results of that general election, I think, left the party with some explanation to give itself for why it declined in electoral support. The Coetzee and Leon report indicated that it was because of the direction the party took under Maimane that they lost their traditional supporters. Now, in this particular phase under John Steenhuisen, they haven't yet had a general election test. They'll get that next year. And whether it is Dr. Malatse or whether it is Mr. Steenhuisen, the question is, what have the last 5 years between that election and the one next year demonstrated to the South African voting public about the party's future? And there I think it isn't just about the personalities, it's actually about the party's ability to project itself beyond its efficient opposition in the National Assembly to projecting for the voting public a viable alternative given the crisis South Africa faces in. And this is a party that's ready to govern not just at municipal level or at regional, provincial level, but that it is ready to govern at the national level. And that, I think, is a hard ask given the decline in 2019 and given that many, many people would have to be convinced that this is a party for the majority of South Africans, not for a specific group, as indicated by the Coetzee-Leon report.
When you look at the decline of the Democratic Alliance and some of the gains that they've scored, the coalition governments in Gauteng, I'll use Tshwane as a prime example because they've been governing Tshwane in a coalition since the 2016 local government elections. How would you say the party has fared outside of the Western Cape and governance, particularly in a city like Tshwane, in a city like Johannesburg, and in a city like Ekurhuleni with the recently axed mayor, Tanya Campbell?
So the Democratic Alliance had a very good record on governing in coalition in the city of Cape Town under Helen Zille. But I think what has happened since 2016 is that those coalitions were coalitions of spite, only to keep the ANC out, and they weren't strongly enough built the way in which Helen Zille, as mayor of Cape Town, worked with her coalition partners. And the condition in Cape Town was also that the ANC in the Western Cape, particularly in Cape Town, was in decline. What we saw in 2021 was a change in the way in which coalitions were being constructed, an attempt to get beyond spite coalitions against the ANC. But again, the conflict between the national initiatives of the Democratic Alliance and the local exigencies, the local requirements by people like Dr. Malatse in Johannesburg meant that you couldn't really build a strong enough coalition with partners if you had a repetition of what we saw in Johannesburg in 2016, where the EFF were people that you couldn't work with, the ANC were people you couldn't work with, and so you had to work with smaller parties who could be more easily swayed by two other large parties. And what we've seen in Johannesburg is that a different opportunistic politics kicked in, which I think the Democratic Alliance at national level decided to opt out of. The Tshwane issue is whether or not governance is enough, whether it is enough to be in administration or whether you actually have to govern appropriately to prevent yourself from being placed under administration. And given what's happening in Tshwane, I think there's real concern that the capital of the country isn't managing its business and its finances correctly.
When you look at service delivery in the capital city, you drive into the capital city, it's in a deplorable state. It's not a true reflection of what the capital city used to be. You compare the capital city and you compare it to the CBD in the city of Cape Town, governed by the same party. You draw the contrast between the two. It's a totally different picture. One is beautiful, governed perfectly, in the words of researchers, but you look at Tshwane, deplorable. Roads, infrastructure crumbling. We go to the townships, refuse sometimes not collected. Go to Hammanskraal, no water, purification water that is there. What is the main difference between the governance in the city of Cape Town and governance in Tshwane?
So I think the city of Cape Town, inherited by the Democratic Alliance in 2009, was a city, or 2011, was a city that had a history of better maintenance and had fewer outside areas that had to be incorporated. What we then saw in the city of Tshwane was a longer record of neglect by the previous administration, and also larger areas that used to be in former homelands, that used to be in the township section, that weren't governed well in apartheid and colonialism, and a longer record in post-apartheid South Africa of negligence. So the party's shortest stint in Tshwane may explain some of the issues. The second issue is, of course, also the way in which the patronage networks constructed under the ANC were not so easy to remove by the party when the DA took position in its coalition phase. So the difficulties are multiple. But the other problem, of course, is also that some parts of Cape Town do resemble some parts of Tshwane. And a researcher like David McDonald points this out in his book on world cities and the way in which inequality inside Cape Town is often used by the party as less unequal than other inequalities elsewhere in the country. But that's no longer a strong enough argument for ordinary people.
Last question, Mr. Fick. The DA has been battling and grappling with the issue of race. You look at this Congress and the demographics represented here, where would you say the DA is in the race debates that is always punted to Helen Zille, particularly on the trajectory of this party, and it's trying to grow back its traditional voter base?
So I think the party's take on race is a very 20th century take. Helen Zille's particular take on race is, I think, lost in translation for many observers and scholars. I think that the party, in its announcements yesterday, in its media conference, kept talking about how we need to look at the diversity, as if diversity is only visual, and then at the same time, in the very same sentence, spoke about how skin color doesn't matter in the party, which I think is at odds with how skin color continues to play a role in South Africa. The people who sit in Diepsloot, the people who sit in Khayelitsha, the people who sit at Orange Farm do not sit there despite their skin color. They sit there because of their skin color, because of the long legacy of colonialism and apartheid, unaddressed by, yes, admittedly, the post-apartheid ANC government. But that's a reality the party cannot ignore. And in trying to speak to the majority of South Africans, if it has its eye on wanting to be the party of governance, and that's a question the party still has to answer, whether it wants to be principled opposition or the party that runs this country, as many South Africans think we are now beyond the ANC. If it wants to do that, it has to speak about race in little more nuanced ways and with greater information for what has happened in the last 40 years, and not stuck in the 60s, stuck in the 70s, with really crude notions that evade power, that evade resource allocation, and evade the legacies of history in this country that live on in the present, even for the majority of people who were born after 1994.
Thank you very much, Mr. Angelo Fick, who is going to be with us in this rolling coverage, bringing you the Federal Congress of the Democratic Alliance. Delegates have trickled in. You've got about 70% of the delegates to this Congress already in the venue for the start of this Congress. I'm also seeing a number of members of Parliament, such as Mr. Alf Leers, who has also arrived here. They are trickling in. Congress will get underway at about 10 o'clock this morning.
All right, Samgela Masego, thank you so much for joining us. We'll touch base with you a little later on as the Congress gets underway. That was a reporter out at the Gallagher Estate in Midrand, where the Democratic Alliance Congress is underway.